Okay, it's right about 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar, Food Safety, an in-depth update on FSMA and how crop insurance figures into food safety for the Pacific Northwest and Upper Great Plains. This webinar is part of our Profit Risk Management series that includes 8 webinars and 8 in-person workshops focused on a variety of topics including food safety regulations, GAP certification, crop insurance, and risk management tools. If you look at the handouts section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all of the information you'll need to join any of the trainings in this series. You'll also find the slideshow being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. Once the presentation is done, I will unmute all attendees and we'll have a brief Q&A. Once the webinar is complete, you'll be prompted to fill out a short evaluation for this webinar. If you could take a few minutes to fill that out, I would appreciate it. This series is possible with support from the USDA Risk Management Agency, the University of Arkansas School of Law, Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who have joined with the Farm Credit Council and Morse Marketing to offer this important series of workshops. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Janie Hipp, the Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, Gordon Killian, Vice President of Corporate Insurance Administration for Northwest Farm Credit Services, and Dean Benson, Vice President of Corporate Insurance Services. Janie Sims Hipp is a Chickasaw Nation citizen and founding director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. She has been a licensed attorney in Oklahoma for more than 30 years and specializes in food and agriculture law and Indian law. Prior to launching the initiative, she served in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for tribal relations to Secretary Tom Vilsack, and prior to her appointment within the office of the secretary, she served in the National Institute of Food and Agriculture at the USDA as the national program leader for farm financial management education, trade adjustment assistance, and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. She also served at the USDA Risk Management Agency as the Risk Management Education Director. Gordon Killian was born and raised in the state of Washington on a dairy farm within the Columbia Basin Irrigation Project. His introduction to crop insurance was in 1998 when he was asked to join the Sloan Insurance Agency specializing in federal crop insurance. He worked as an agent partner until 2005 when the crop insurance portfolio was sold to Northwest Farm Credit Services. He has had many duties within the organization, including agent, regional vice president, and now VP of Corporate Insurance Administration. Dean Benson was the recipient of the 2015 National Crop Insurance Services Outstanding Service Award in recognition for outstanding service and outreach to small, limited resource, and socially disadvantaged farmers. Dean has been in crop insurance for 23 years and was an agency owner from 1999 to 2008, servicing policies in Washington and Oregon. He sold the agency in 2008 to Northwest Farm Credit Services, where he currently serves as the Senior Vice President for Corporate Insurance Services, working with 45 branch offices throughout Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, promoting crop insurance risk management programs. Dean does not consider crop insurance agents as salesmen, but rather risk management consultants, tailoring the tools available to growers to best fit each individual situation. With that, we will start on our first presentation, and Janie will be kicking that off. Janie?
Thanks, Brian, and welcome to our presentation. If you're joining us today, I'm glad to have you before this wonderful Memorial Weekend. But if you're joining us on an archived, participant taking part in our archived webinar recording, then welcome whenever you might be actually tuning in. We also intend to use these recordings as well as the content we've developed for these webinars in our in-person events that are on the schedule that is also listed in your handout section. And so please know that it's available for your use at any time. what we've done on these presentations is we've tried to do as comprehensive a set of materials for you as possible on each one of the content areas in our 8 webinars. We will have those with us when we're actually in person with you, but we also know that there's so much information to cover that we would rather provide you likely more than we can get to in one particular webinar sitting, but at least you have it there available for your study because some of these issues do really require you to study where you are, what it is you're producing, and how you manage your risk. The other thing I'll share with you is that Gordon and Dean, who are both on the recording and webinar with us today, and myself are strong proponents of and advocates of comprehensive risk management at the producer level. It's so very important for you to take the time necessary to literally sit and consider what it is that you're putting in motion, what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your operation, and what are the risks that you're going to have to deal with. Some of those risks might be financial, some of them might be in the marketplace. Some of them crop insurance for sure can readily help you manage as you move forward. Some of them are emerging risks, and some have been around for a long time, and you just have to know and keep up with what's happening in this particular arena. But it's very important, particularly in this day and time, to take the time necessary to actually do risk assessment on a regular and frequent basis. One of the areas that is changing in the coming years, although the general principles of liability around food safety have been around for quite some time, and we're going to go into those in a few minutes, the landscape around food safety is changing, particularly in the area that we're going to touch on today, which is around the whole produce arena. So if you'll hang tight with us, I want to share with you just some background information that kind of sets the stage for a food safety discussion. I have found that in my work with producers for years and years that if we roll it back and actually start from the beginning so that you have a greater sense of why the state and local and now tribal and federal regulatory folks actually look at these issues, so that you have a kind of a foundational understanding of what it is that's in front of you, you might have a better sense of why the requirements are written the way they are. And so with that kind of in mind, let's start, Brian, and I'm going to roll through some of the early slides. My particular slides are set apart in sections that really kind of start with what is food safety all about, what is it designed to focus on, and then some general principles of legal liability around food safety. And then I've given you quite a few slides that really talk about the new Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Act, and what the new regulations are with regard to implementation of that act. But before I do that, if Gordon or Dean are on the phone, if you could kind of spend a few minutes just, the folks who might listen to this are likely already going to be in the Pacific Northwest and Upper Great Plains area, but if you could give the folks who might not be from that area who are listening what a sense of the various crops and livestock that are present in the agricultural sector up in that region. Gordon or Dean, could you jump in and kind of give us a little brief intro?
Sure. Gordon, you want to take that one, or do you want me to do it?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I tell you, in the Pacific Northwest, we are blessed to have a lot of commodities growing. On the crop insurance side of things, Janie, we insure right now over 42 different crops, that are part of the federal program. And then there's other crops on the named peril side for that crop hail, things that aren't included with the federal programs that we insure also. There are a number of crops that currently, there isn't a federal program for, but all of those are insurable under what we call the whole farm revenue coverage, or whole farm revenue protection. And so our agency, writes a number of those policies on producers that, may or may not have that those underlying programs available to them. But literally, there's hundreds of crops being produced here in the Pacific Northwest. Right now, we only have 42 of those insurable under the federal crop insurance program. So.
Well, and that to me is every region of the country is literally so different, and it's always exciting for me to think about how things shift a little bit in terms of crops grown in a particular area. The other thing I'm glad that you mentioned is one of our later webinars is going to really do a deep dive on emerging issues and sort of a capstone conversation around the entire crop insurance arena, and it's going to just be really heavy on just those issues, including the whole farm revenue protection. And so we're going to get deeper into those kinds of issues then. But I'm going to start in a little bit on just sort of and believe me, I'm not a microbiologist. I am a lawyer, so I have been doing this work for quite some time, but I am, going to walk you through some of the things that really fall into the category of food science and food microbiology. When you're in the area of food safety, normally we talk about things as being hazards. And the reason why we talk about them being hazards is that they lead to some sort of potential for harm in the consuming public, or they could have, display some sort of harm in the further food manufacturing arena if you're actually trying to do value added. But technically, we are focused more heavily on foodborne illnesses that are harmful to humans. Now, some of these new requirements under the FSMA also are surfacing up things that could be hazards in the food safety arena for animals. And so we'll get to those in a little bit in our conversation. But normally we're talking about hazards that tend to fall into some major categories: biological hazards, chemical hazards, physical hazards. And when we talk about food safety, we also often talk about things that are usually so small that they can't be seen by your eye. I always tell producers when I talk to them that it's worth it if you didn't go to an ag college, or if it's been a while, that it's always good to take some time, make an appointment, and go down and talk to somebody at your tribal college or at your land grant 1862 institution, and see if you can go into the lab and actually have one of the food scientists literally show you what these microorganisms look like. Sometimes we have to see things before we believe that it's a visible problem. And so it is helpful to actually take the time to do that. And I always tell people when I do food safety trainings that, and Dean and Gordon, you're probably going to get a chuckle out of this, but I remember a day when I was very young, and I'm 60, where my great-grandmother had a little corner grocery store. And it was not uncommon to walk into that grocery store or any other little corner store in small towns or big towns and see, pop bottles kind of lined up I'll never forget it, lined up on the windowsill. And it was such a childhood fascination to actually go look in those bottles and see what things had been packaged in those bottles. You could find bugs, you could find, pieces of metal, you could find pieces of rats. I mean, literally, it was amazing what was coming through the food manufacturing system back in the day. And really, people didn't think too much of it. We tried to, we tried to not gag too much when we saw it, but it was a reality. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that I can actually point to long lines of litigation and cases that have been filed over the years against producers or food manufacturers that have to do with these hazards that somehow end up in our food supply. We've fast forwarded to more modern days, and it's extremely unusual to find those sorts of, physical hazards in the system. But these microorganisms are literally everywhere. They're in the soil and water, they're in plants and products, they're in utensils and equipment, they're in your own gut. Food handlers have to deal with them and be aware of them. They're in animal feed, animal hides, they're in air and dust. And it's not uncommon for us to hear in the popular media. I saw a news report this morning about a woman who is now, finding herself in the middle of, the eye of the storm at the national level because there is something in her gut and in her physical body that is now resistant to antibiotics. And when that happens, the public health system in the whole United States, federal, state, local, and tribal as well, are all very much about finding out what that source is. What is the microorganism that's in her system that is causing the problem? And so, again, if you could switch to the next slide, Brian. Those things are in our food, or they can be in our food. And our goal, and the public health system's goal, and all producers and agriculture sector and food sector's goal, is to get those out of the system itself, because the last thing any of us want to do is to pass along any of these microorganisms in our food onto the ultimate consumer. Nobody wants to do that. The reality is, though, that these little microorganisms can be quite efficient in not getting out of the way. And I've actually had food scientists here on our campus, as well as food scientists that I've talked to across the country, that it's highly unlikely that we will ever get to 100% all times, at every moment of every day, no foodborne illness circumstance. That's not the world we live in. And with the growing population and a lot of other factors, this is just an ongoing battle. And Dean and Gordon, jump in here anytime you want to either say you're nuts and you don't know what you're talking about, or yes, we have seen this too in our lives in this whole arena. It's just tough. And these are pathogenic, disease-causing microorganisms. Some of them can be just focused on food spoilage, so that you just don't want to eat it. That's a minor problem compared to the disease pieces that some of these bacteria can cause. Some of them, quite interestingly enough, these microorganisms can end up, if in a controlled use, can actually end up with a desired value-added food product. But we're not going to talk about fermentation foods and actually that whole arena now. All I'm going to say to you today is if your food product that you want to put into the food supply and actually sell in the marketplace surrounds fermentation, you've got to do a lot of homework so that you actually know exactly what you're doing and exactly what you're setting in motion, and have a very controlled use of that. Some do actually nothing in the foods. They're just naturally occurring and are not considered to be, technically contamination, but some are considered contamination. And if you actually think about how to control them, that's really why we're walking through these sorts of food safety trainings now and in the future, is what can we as producers do to actually get extremely aware of our food system and what our protocol are at the farm level, because a lot of the requirements and regulations around food safety are pressing down into the farm level. So in some cases, heating will destroy these things. In other cases, refrigeration can slow or stop it. Sometimes freezing will. Heat and cold is very important, and moisture levels are very important in terms of the growing spaces for these particular microorganisms. I think I've already touched on this particular slide, so I'll just move on past it. One of our wonderful food science friends here on our campus, Steve Soderman, we've done several trainings together, actually shared this slide with me in terms of controlling the growth of bacteria in food. There's a lot of ways to sort of attack this. Some is temperature, like I mentioned. Some is time. Some bacteria can actually double every 20 minutes. So the longer you leave them in a place and in a state that they are in circumstances where they can double, they're going to do it. So you really have to know exactly the propensity for certain types of bacteria to actually be present in the food that you're producing, and what you can do to actually control the growth. So oxygen sometimes can be a growth factor for bacteria. Many times moisture can. If you're moving food through the food system and supply chain so that people are actually ending up eating it, then you've got to really pay attention to the moisture level within your raw food product or within your value-added food product so that you can really look at these things through the eyes of trying to prevent any sort of microbial growth that would be detrimental to humans' health. Next slide. How to control for these? It's always good, particularly that first, bullet there at the top of this particular slide. If you are in a circumstance where you're adding value and you're adding other ingredients to your raw product, you really need to think through all of your ingredients and really think about what are your specifications for the ingredients that you place into the raw to create the value-added product. How do you actually control for what those particular ingredients need in order to kind of tamp down any potential for pathogens or any other microbial growth that would lead to a foodborne illness? If you're in the process of processing these together or separately, think through your cooking, your pasteurization. Are you a shelf-stable product, or are you creating some other product? How do you actually control for all of those things that's on that other slide that Steve shared with us that would control for moisture, oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. Packaging is one of those areas that a lot of folks think it's all about the language that's on the package, or is the labeling to make sure. Those things are for sure important, but sometimes I have seen, and I know you've seen it too, packages that you buy a product and the seal is not maintained. It won't hold the seal. That is one of the worst problems you can possibly have, because that inability to hold a seal means that you are basically creating a corridor through which potential foodborne illness can take root. And so packaging, when you are actually doing packaging to deliver a food product into the hands of a consumer, is extremely important, and paying attention to, what kind of package you use, what is the seal, can it be improved, et cetera. Labeling, we're not going to hardly go into labeling at all today. We can save that for another time frame, but there's a lot of food science specialists that are out there who can help you actually determine what the newest standards are for what's on your label. But it's very, very important that your labels are in compliance with federal law and that they provide the necessary information for your consumer. But we're also going to talk about some of the language on your label in a few minutes, and how it can also open the door for liability that you might not have thought of. Farm-to-fork food safety quality programs are out there. A lot of people talk about good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, HACCP, which is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Planning. Every state has basic safety and sanitation laws that have been on the books for years and years and years. The really important point for producers to think about is, what are the laws in this whole food safety arena, safety, sanitation, et cetera, that apply to me? And that really requires you to deconstruct what you're doing. What food am I working with? What are my growing characteristics? What are my harvesting characteristics? What am I doing with that food? Where am I going with that food? Into what market? What does the food itself respond to? Does it have a hard shell? Does it have a porous shell? I mean, there's a lot of things to really kind of deconstruct the potential for particular foodborne illnesses for your particular crop. And so basically what you're doing, and I know Dean and Gordon are probably nodding their head here, is you're doing a basic risk assessment with regard to food safety. And so it's very important to do these sorts of things, because they do impact your financial feasibility. They do impact your overall risk, for your operation. So again, I'm not going to go into very much detail. The next slide, several slides, really talk about and give you some data about the types of illnesses that are caused by bacterial pathogens. If you'll stay on this slide just for a minute, can you go back, Brian, one? Everybody hears about E. coli. You would almost have to never tune into the news to hear about it. But we usually don't hear about it frequently, but we always hear about it when it has hit the national media and there's recalls and it hits, big suppliers, and all of a sudden everything is being rolled back up and you're being asked to look in your freezer or in your refrigerator and throw away something or take it back to the manufacturer. Chipotle just had a more recent outbreak in the last year or so of E. coli. That was an E. coli specific cause. Again, E. coli, each of these foodborne pathogens has its own unique characteristics. 2 to 4 days of incubation for E. coli, diarrhea and some other pretty dramatic health impacts can happen, but it can be found in contaminated milk, meat, fruits, vegetables, and water. And it can take a while to get it out of your system as a person, but also get it out of the food supply system. Salmonella has many, many strains. The symptoms are very similar to E. coli, but each one of them can usually find its way into our food supply in kind of the common. Some of them seem to be more common in certain types of foods than in others. I'll tell you, salmonella is quite frequently reported as a foodborne illness problem. Sprouts, and this is a little footnote for anyone who might be growing sprouts where you are. You literally have a heightened protocol that you need to put in place in your operations, because sprouts have been known to literally be, one of those products that has a frequent foodborne illness problem. And so there is a whole separate body of requirements that are specific to sprouts. That's how often it comes up. And so if that is your chosen food product to actually grow and harvest and get out there into the food supply, then you've just got to know going into it that your risk is a different profile than maybe your neighbors. And so keep that in mind. If you go on the cdc.gov website, you can actually do a query on each one of these types of bacterial pathogens, and it can show you what the normal circumstances are for these things being reported into the public health system and how often they come up. And many of these web pages on CDC can actually tell you how many instances of these types of foodborne illnesses have come about in the last several years. Some of them you can actually pull it up year after year after year and see. Listeria is another common bacterial pathogen. The most recent outbreak involves some folks out in your neck of the woods, Dean and Gordon, the CRF Frozen Foods folks in Pasco, Washington, who deal with a lot of frozen vegetables. And that was a large recall just in the last.
It really was. And they're still working on that one. I mean, that, from my understanding is that this listeria can just kind of get in the cracks and crevices and things that you can't really see, and it's like it's a very serious problem, but also sometimes it's really hard to kind of get cleaned up, and so it's definitely a problem that they ran into. But one of the things that I hear when all the stuff that you're going through, Janie, is really, it's like it's out there. I do think that at least in the U.S. we're looking for these things, and we're trying to keep track of them, and I guess put the best business practices together to help avoid them, which is a huge positive for products that are produced and distributed in the U.S. I think that's a positive that we need to make sure we know the problems are out there and we're looking for them. So
I totally agree with you, and we actually have a lot more kind of forces on the ground. I mean, you have the federal players, but you also have state and local players. You also have tribal players. I know many tribes that have environmental health people who are on staff who literally go out and do these sorts of inspections and make sure that their retail food establishments are exactly what they need to be. Because you're right, we do have a very robust system. But, you know, and you said it too, these things are so microscopic that once they take hold in your manufacturing plant or in your barn or, you know, in your planting system or on your equipment, they're very hard to get rid of. The Bluebell Creamery's ice cream listeria issue, everyone probably on the call or listening in later probably knows that ice cream was gone for, you know, several months. It's just now kind of seeping back into our grocery stores here, but they literally had to close almost all, if not all, of their plants. It was such a pervasive problem that they had to for the public health, just to take a deep breath, stop, get things kind of back under control, because once they kind of get a foothold in your production system, regardless of whether it's raw or further manufactured, it can be a problem. And so I really think the whole important nature of staying out in front of these issues and staying in a preventive mode and staying on a kind of vigilant mode is extremely important for producers. But I agree with you. I think we are as robust as we can possibly be in the U.S. Again, I've thrown a couple of more slides at you to explain what some of the other kind of more common reportable illnesses are that we still, you know, have come up from time to time. This slide, particularly prevention of foodborne illness, really talks about just the various levels of things that you can do, raw products as well as value added, to really keep things as clean and as sanitary as possible. And it falls down not only to the actual physical place and all your equipment, but it also falls into categories like how you chill, cook, how deeply, you know, you reach the appropriate heating levels, your cleaning areas, as well as the personal hygiene of you and the people that you actually have working with you. And every time I give this talk, I always kind of remind people that these are things that Auntie and Grandma actually told us. So some of this is very common sense. A lot of it is very common sense. It's just making sure that you don't get too busy in your operation that you forget to actually be extremely vigilant in these areas. I put this slide in here again to just show you the various potential sources of fecal contamination, just one source. And it literally can come from all levels. But, you know, what that tells you by looking at this particular slide that all leads, you know, into the potential for product contamination is you really got to keep your eye on every potential hazardous source and have a plan for actually doing everything you can to prevent that from entering into your product line. A lot of folks also are starting to talk more and more and more about good agricultural practices and GAP certification. Literally, that is a part of this whole conversation around food safety, and it is one of the tools that you have as a producer or as a food marketer to make sure that you're doing everything that you can and have proper protocols in place at the farm level to really kind of put your arms around getting out in front of and preventing things from happening. But it really is, you know, going back into what we do in the field and during the transport of food to the consumer that can prevent contamination. And if it does occur, how do we keep it from spreading? And the GAP certification programs that are out there in the private sector, but also are being pushed very heavily by USDA and others, are meant to really provide a means for producers to actually prove and have records and really protocol in place that can actually assure the public that they're utilizing the best potential practices to prevent foodborne illness possible. The whole purpose of these GAP certifications is to really kind of get at the best practices, I guess you'd say, of how to prevent these things from happening. Let's keep moving on. But the GAP certification piece is just one of many tools. Some actually, some operations and some food manufacturing operations go so far as to actually doing global GAP or Global Food Safety Initiative voluntary certification, which is GFSI. And so it's just very much, basically a professional, protocol that you voluntarily are engaged in, but it basically is a I don't know, I hate to call it a seal of approval, but it is if you can say that your operation is GFSI certified, then you have a higher level of confidence that other people who might buy your food products have within your food, whatever you're putting forward into the marketplace. The pieces of the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, those are moving into the required arena. There are exceptions to some of the standards that are embedded in FSMA. That's what I'm going to refer to it now moving forward. Many of these commercial certification programs are all voluntary, but FSMA is going to be moving us into a place that starts to look a lot more like required components that operations must comply with. Keep going. Again, Steve shared with me this wonderful slide. I think you can reproduce this for other time frames, but I just wanted to show you. He just threw one that's one of his favorites at me, and it covers a time period past. But if you actually look at each you have to look at each particular year. It's very important because a lot of folks. The reason why I threw this slide in, which is this pie chart about the number of outbreaks per year, that's going to change every year, okay? Every 5 years of reporting period, this pie chart is going to look differently. But for this particular time period, just take a look at leafy greens, fruits and nuts, and vine produce. I mean, if you actually add those pieces of the pie up, that is a large cross-section of foodborne illness outbreaks. So it gives you kind of a sense of where these things normally kind of emerge from, which piece of the food supply chain. And I will tell you, if you actually, we talk a lot about food safety, and it seems to be this looming large thing in our heads. But at the end of the day, although we do have illnesses and deaths every year that are traceable to food safety, they are very small in comparison to our population. And I think it's the point you were making. Was it Dean or Gordon who was speaking? Was it Gordon?
That was me, Dean.
Dean.
Yeah.
But, Dean, the point you were making, I think, needs to be made again here, is overall, the incidence is very low compared to our overall population. But we still need to keep our eye on what components of the food system are actually, where are these pathogens actually most likely to take hold, and do what we can to actually, if that is our chosen food production, if that's where we want to be earning our living, say in leafy greens, then we got to know what we need to do to be at the highest level of safety in that particular arena. Wouldn't you say, Dean?
Oh, absolutely. I just think you need to be aware of what the potential issues are, and what are the prevention areas that you can focus on to limit your exposure.
Absolutely.
Janie,
so, Brian, can you keep?
This is Gordon. Oh.
Yeah, absolutely, Gordon.
Back to that slide. I'm just curious, and I agree totally with what you've said. I don't know if you have this information, but it would be interesting to me. Are the leafy greens, the nuts, the vine, and the grains issues out there predominantly to organic grown produce, or is it the conventional, or maybe we don't have that information, but I do think, along with what you're saying here, is that depending on the type or the practice that you're using to grow these, might require some additional precautions, especially in the organic arena.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on that. I'm one of these weird people, and I can say this on a webinar, and everybody who is on it probably would agree. I'm one of these weird people that I have signed up for the FDA daily reports on food safety issues. And I will tell you that right now, and I don't know why this is, because I mean I have my thoughts, but I don't know that they're fully substantiated. But right now you can actually see more recalls in the organic sector than you can elsewhere. And I think that does fall into the arena of, it could be tied to some practices there, but it also could be tied to the reality that we have more organic products in the system. Does that make sense? So as a result, you're going to see spikes in those numbers that you wouldn't have seen before because there weren't that many organic products in the system. And so I think it really bears, and it's important to kind of unpack those data, I think, and really seriously consider what is the driver on that, because there is a slide and a little bit on that talks about, yes, we've had our numbers go up in some of these foodborne illness outbreaks, but the reality is we also have a higher population numbers in our country. We also have more immune compromised people. We have an aging population. We have people who really don't cook. So do you know what I mean? I mean, they don't really take the steps necessary to try to control for that at the home level. And so it's very, I'm glad that we have as robust a food system and food safety system in this country that we do, because we actually can kind of peel apart and get to the bottom of these numbers. What I've always been concerned about, and I remain concerned about it, is, we've got to deconstruct these food safety requirements for the producers so that they don't just drown in the regulatory requirements. That's my job. That's your job, is to try to figure out how we can, make it as easy as possible for the producers themselves to actually, accommodate their operations to these shifting foodborne illness realities. This slide, particularly this top hazards in produce, it was also from a 10-year time period. We can actually pull this information yearly, but I think it's important to look back and see where the problems are over time. And if you'll notice, one of the screens that I had previously, one of the food scientists that's become a good friend of mine over time has said, regardless, we always see a spike in foodborne illness outbreaks in the summer months. Well, but if you roll your thoughts all the way back to microorganisms and what they need to survive and thrive, they need moisture, they need, heat. So, of course, you're going to be a higher incidence of this in the summer. I just think it's very interesting to track the data that comes out of CDC and some of the other federal agencies that track this sort of thing. And when these foodborne illnesses kind of pop up, and realize that during the summer months, we probably need to be at a heightened vigilance in our operations, because that's also basically when harvest happens, right? And then the other piece of that puzzle is, and you hear about this all the time around, say, November and Thanksgiving. You'll hear just as many people talking about cooking your turkey properly. Well, they're not doing that so that you can get a nice glaze on it. They're doing it so that the pathogens that are present in fowl, so to speak, are tamped down by proper cooking and proper handling in the home. So you will always see a spike of public education, reminding people how to handle the food, blah, 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 during that time period, because we know that there's a ramping up of eating of certain types of things in that time period. So I think as a producer, I always try to live my life according to what the producers are thinking. But if I'm a producer of some of these products, then I'm gonna need to kind of really get a grasp on what are the foodborne illness outbreak spikes, what are some of the drivers for this, and really kind of think about how I want to construct my operation in such a way that I don't walk myself into problems that I don't need, right? And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. This riskiest produce for the same like 10-year time period, there you go. I mean, green-based salad and lettuce, a high level. Is that because of the inherent properties of lettuce that causes it to be more inclined to foodborne illness carriers, or is it something else, or is it the handling? And I will tell you that sprouts always end up in the top 10 of these, and I think that's why there is such a focused attention on the uniqueness of sprouts and trying to make sure that if you're going to be putting sprouts into the food supply, that you do that with a high focus on food safety. Keep going. So the other thing I remind people of is in this slide, why more foodborne illness? I mentioned it previously. We have an aging population. A lot more people are eating produce. But we also have more immune-compromised citizens, and we also have, food that comes at us year-round, regardless of our growing season. We import a lot of these food products as well. You also have a lot of consumer preferences that are moving in the area of ready-to-eat and bagged lettuce, so that you don't have a lot of spoilage when you get it home. But the other thing I remind people of is it's easy to say this is, why is this so much? Well, the reality is we live in a CSI world. We live in a world now where the science allows us to follow foodborne illnesses with greater specificity. And what that means is that if I get sick and I go in and I get sick because of a food I ate, the CSI, the DNA fingerprint of that particular food, can literally be followed in the science. And it can be followed with great specificity even to the farm it's grown on. And, that is a hard and kind of arduous thing to follow if you're an administrative investigator or somebody who's interested in this. But the reality is we do have the science capabilities to do that. And so what that means is if I'm a producer of that particular food product and it has a propensity to foodborne illness outbreaks, then I need to know that I've got not just a moral responsibility, but I live in a world where science allows that to be traced all the way back to me. And so it's just, we've got this whole kind of cauldron of reasons why there is a heightened attention to food safety. There always has been in this country, but I think it's ratcheting up quite a bit. And I think our responsibilities are to make sure that producers have every little bit of information they can to do proper risk assessments and really prevent as many problems before they can start. Keep going. On this particular slide, the Outbreaks of Produce Common Foods Report, I'm not going to spend much time. I've already kind of visited on those particular issues already. So if you could move on. Elements of GAP, it's very, if you actually kind of peel apart GAP certification, it's going to seem a lot like HACCP certification or planning, because really the essence of all of these kind of protocol are really to deconstruct what is happening on your operation and really think through how you can avoid problems. So if you're dealing with a GAP certification, you're going to be looking at water quality for sure. If you look at the new FSMA requirements, there is a water component in that. If you're looking at HACCP planning in a produce context, you're going to be dealing with some water issues. So what's common across all of these kind of certification or planning or protocol, requirements is some kind of basic attention to some basic areas that you as a producer need to really think about. So one of them is water quality. This particular slide deals with not only water quality but water uses. What are your irrigation practices? Do you have records? Do you do common water testing? Do you do it on a regular basis? How close are your livestock to the water? Where is your water coming from that you're actually using? Surface water can contain more pathogens and parasites. Well water is less likely to harbor those pathogens but may have other problems. So it very much is, knowing where your water comes from and knowing the course your water takes while you're using it on your operations is extremely important. Next slide. Livestock, pets, wildlife, worker health and sanitation, your soil amendments, your use of manure on your operation, what is happening in your equipment, tools, and buildings area. What do you use manure at all in your operation? Do you use biosolids in your operation? Do you do composting in your operation? Have you done the composting to the protocol of degree of heat in that composting and the turning rate, et cetera, that can lead to a breakdown of those pathogens? So it's just important to actually kind of, again, I keep saying deconstruct, but it really is important to kind of compartmentalize everything that's happening in your operation so that you can kind of tackle each one of these potential problems and have a plan, which is the HACCP planning, and a protocol that a GAP certification can kind of test you against. Practices that can prevent problems are fairly common. I've listed some of those in this particular slide. Keep going. Livestock, pets, and wildlife can be major sources of contamination. Remember that slide I had a few slides ago around fecal contamination? It's kind of hard to keep control of birds and livestock and pets and their desires to do their business in your field. I mean, that happens. And particularly on the wild animals and birds component, I mean, how in heaven's name do you actually control for that? But the reality is there are some things that you can do to try to kind of lessen that impact. A lot of folks might have, problems with using scare tactics or fencing or depredation. There's just ways that you can think about modifying the surrounding environment around your fields if you don't particularly like one form of control or another, but understand that you still have some responsibilities for doing everything that you think is possible to control for livestock, pets, and wildlife. And quite frankly, children were thrown in there because it is quite common for small children who run rampant in your fields to actually decide they're going to do it right there, and you don't want to actually have that happen. Worker health and sanitation is important throughout the food system. I don't care how big or small your operation is. If you have workers who are in your system, you've got to be planning around not only how well they're trained, but what are the hygiene issues that you need to train them on if they haven't been trained on. I always tell people that it's really important to, even if you know exactly who you're working with on a year-to-year basis and you know them really well, and they've worked with you for a long time, take the time every year to have a meeting, or not even just every year, but more frequently, have a meeting around safety sanitation, make a record of the meeting, make a record of what you've gone over, et cetera, et cetera. It's a good practice to really think about what you tell your employees or your workers in the field and how you can actually help them do their job better, but also reach the dual goal of dealing with foodborne illness possibilities. Next slide. Equipment, tool, and buildings. Again, this slide really walks through quite a few points around washing, rinsing, sanitizing, cleaning tools, avoiding how you put them up, avoiding contact between tool locations and the actual harvested product or growing in the field product. You've got to really think about how your tools can be, in essence, vectors for the problem itself and how they can spread a particular foodborne illness problem, particularly the microscopic level ones, and what you need to do to actually continue to cover and clean and and be very vigilant about what's going on within your structures, but also in your equipment and tools specifically. Keep going. This slide talks about some different sources of water. I actually would, I would consider in the future actually having an even more vigilant testing system around your water. You know, water is extremely important in the West, but it's equally important everywhere else. And just knowing where your water sources are coming from and having records of frequent testing. This slide just gives you some ideas of potential testing requirements, but I'll tell you that checking your local requirements is very, very important. You actually may live in a jurisdiction that requires more frequent checking, and so just know that you know, water sources are important, and keeping good records and doing your regular testing of your water sources is really an important component. I know of farmers all over the country that have backed up and taken the time to actually do their water well testing and had to take protocol immediately because there were things in the water that they knew shouldn't be there. And for instance, E. coli levels that they needed to try to control for that they had no idea were present. So just do that kind of water testing ever so often. The other thing I'll share with you, and I'm going to shift now for a minute into legal liability and insurance issues. I'm not talking about crop insurance. We're going to, Gordon and Dean are on call to talk about that in a few minutes. But a lot of folks kind of look at me when I do these kinds of trainings and go, well, what am I supposed to do here? And if you look online at FLIP, F-L-I-P, Food Liability Insurance Program, you know, there are others, but this one I just threw in some slides to show you that there are actually insurance providers out there who can help you kind of sleep better at night. This particular insurance is set aside for or is created for smaller businesses, and I'll tell you, to me, Gordon and Dean, talking about crop insurance and building it into your business plan is just a constant that you have in your plan that you pay for. Is equally important with regard to the legal liability insurance pertaining around just small businesses that are involved in food on this flip side of the equation. Because I've, you know, person after person has said, well, it's just too expensive. Well, what you're going to be wishing you had it if you are ever drawn into a foodborne illness outbreak that you need to prove your way out of. You really place your whole operation at risk by not thinking about what you can acquire in terms of insurance for very little money in the grand scheme of things. If you're talking about having to extract yourself out of an administrative proceeding or a lawsuit with regard to food liability. Keep going to the next slide. FLIP actually you qualify for basically applying to actually get this insurance from FLIP. If you do baked goods, beverage carts, cottage food industry, catering, commercial kitchens, farmers markets, food trailers, food festivals, I mean, you name it. It's a very comprehensive list of kind of small purveyors in the food industry. Keep going. I threw in this slide about what do you get with that. It looks like a lot of other insurances to me. You have a general liability aggregate limit of $2 million. $2 million is very common if you're trying to get your food into like a regional or small grocery store or even a large one. It's very common to have a $2 million policy as a requirement. I know of some farmers markets that require a $2 million policy requirement in order for you to sell on the market. But this one has various components. I did not list all of them. There are endorsements allowed so you can add other coverages, but it does give you that sense of kind of a general product and general commercial liability policy. Dean and Gordon, is there anything different out where you are in Northwest and Pacific Northwest and Upper Great Plains that you know of, kind of in this general product liability arena?
This is Gordon. I'm not aware of anything different. Dean?
No, yeah, I think this is not our area of expertise, but this is pretty comprehensive. I don't know of anything else that that would be available out here that's different than what you're outlined.
Yeah, and these are recent numbers. I actually rechecked these numbers yesterday before we did our call yesterday, and so these are still good in terms of coverage, maximums that you can get. Again, if you're going to take out insurance, you actually do need to read the contract of insurance. That's a really kind of important thing to do so that you know what your requirements are for having the insurance and reporting when you are experience a loss or need their help. You have some responsibilities that you need to uphold in addition to paying the premium. But so why do you need it? Why do you need legal liability protection regardless of whether you have insurance or not? Food safety liability is strict liability under U.S. law. It is product liability, and food is defined as a good under the Uniform Commercial Code, which means all of the Uniform Commercial Code provisions, unless there are specific exclusions that would pertain to a good that is in the commercial marketplace, also applies to food. So goods have warranties that attach to them when they move through commerce, and the manufacturer or the source of food is liable for the harm it causes in the stream of commerce under U.S. law. So when food harm is caused, an investigation is usually undertaken by the state, local, and or federal authorities, and tribal authorities could also act in this space as well if you're a tribe that has environmental health officers that have the responsibility for investigations. So when an administrative investigation happens in a foodborne illness outbreak, you're really talking about those public health authorities kind of gathering their information necessary to actually trace down where the foodborne illness is coming from. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes those can end up in recalls, which can be quite expensive for the food producer or the food manufacturer. Literally, a recall is what it sounds like. You actually pull that product off the shelves and pull it back away from any distributors that might have it. That can be quite an expensive endeavor. But you also need to understand that, and this is apart from FSMA and apart from any sort of administrative investigation by a public health authority, you also have exposure for private lawsuits that could be filed against you based on the injury or death that was caused by that food. Now, of course, whoever files that is going to have to prove that you were the source. But think for a minute back to what I said about the CSI reality we live in. So what happens in a lawsuit circumstance is the discovery will actually ensue, and a form of investigating the facts will be undertaken. The chain of custody of that food, literally from your farm to the food manufacturer throughout the chain onto the actual consumer, will be a part of whatever administrative investigation happens, but also whatever litigation might or might not happen. But just know that these types of lawsuits are filed a lot and have been for hundreds of years. This is not something new that's just come about in the last 10 years. I've been educating new lawyers for quite some time on very, very old cases that were brought around a food that caused a harm. And so this is not something that's just tied to FSMA. It exists kind of in the common law of the United States regardless. So normally, the sources of foodborne illnesses, when you look at these sorts of administrative investigations or discovery in a lawsuit, it usually goes back to some sort of unclean condition somewhere or some kind of contamination, either intentional or unintentional, at the source of the food, and usually involves unsanitary conditions in the processing, storage, handling, harvesting, production, or transportation. It happens somewhere, basically, if you think about it, in that food chain. so the problem here is if you are actually implied in a foodborne illness outbreak and some impending lawsuit happens, those are usually brought by people who were harmed either through the death of a loved one or through the protracted illness of someone they care about. And so because food is considered a product and because it's considered a good under the UCC, then you're in an area of the law called products liability law, and those are usually areas that have fairly high jury verdicts. So I'm just telling you as a lawyer, it's not the place you want to be. And so your better course of action is always to do whatever you can to prevent, because you don't want to be pulled into that sort of broad-based investigation, nor do you want to be pulled into a lawsuit at any point in time, believe me. But strict liability applies to food being placed into commerce in this country. And the interesting thing about it, it's not interesting if it's you, but we are seeing we're seeing now more criminal investigation cases being opened with regard to food and foodborne illness. Those were unheard of decades ago. But there have been criminal enforcement issues and cases that have been brought up. It doesn't happen very often, but it is capable of happening in today's legal environment. Keep going. A few slides I threw into this particular slide deck just because I wanted to show you what warranties look like under the law so that you can understand that they do literally apply to food. They do, when you give somebody a warranty, that can be either in writing or it can be orally. And sometimes the courts, even if you've not done it in writing or orally, they might imply that a warranty exists. And I've given you several slides here that really talk about what the Uniform Commercial Code has adopted in terms of broad principles that apply around warranties. So basically what warranties mean is that if you're going to put something into the stream of commerce, which think of food in a commercial marketplace, then whoever does that is basically saying that that particular food meets certain standards. Either you've said it in writing or you've said it verbally, that creates some expectation on the part of the consumer that it's going to live up to what you say it is. And so it's very important to understand that those warranties exist kind of in a background sort of way. The FSMA regs don't talk about this at all, but this is one of those areas of common law that apply no matter what. And so just be aware. I've thrown in this slide, and if you'll just keep going, Brian, there's several other slides. This next slide talks about implied warranties so that you can understand what those kinds of warranties are. I've given you some examples again, and please understand also this other item. FSMA is a federal requirement, but the states are the state and local governmental authorities, and tribes are moving into these spaces as well, are the basic boots on the ground, so to speak. And when you talk about these kinds of implied warranties and contracts and things of that nature, you're really talking about issues of state and local law, and states do differ, just like tribes differ or localities differ in terms of what they require people who are engaged in commerce actually say or do, and how long it can take for you to be able to sue, which is a statute of limitations. I mean, there's a lot of peculiarities that change depending on physically where you are. So what I'm saying is that if I'm sitting in Oklahoma, my state law may be totally different than what it is in Washington. It could be very parallel and very overlapping, very much the same. But don't assume that just because we live in the United States that all of the localities and states and tribes actually have the exact same law in total lockstep with each other. We all know that's not the case, and it is not the case in food. So knowing who you are, where you are, what you're growing, and what the legal environment is around you is so, so very important in analyzing your risk. Keep going. Again, there are differences state to state. I think that this slide addresses that. I've already said it. Again, this next slide, do your homework. There are some basic standards that are kind of sit around all of the federal food laws, but they basically are the common sense sort of things that I've talked to you and provided these slides for kind of throughout. So what are you to do? I get this all the time. What am I to do? What is a farmer to do? It's the same thing that you would do when you're analyzing. I believe when you're analyzing, how do I protect against crop loss? Put on your reasonable business person hat and try to limit your liability, your exposure, and your risk. You've got to know what your risk is. You've got to manage for it. You've got to manage your exposure by what you do. You've got to examine all of your practices and all of your relationships so that you actually prevent as many problems as you can. And I will tell you, and Gordon and Dean weigh in here, get and keep your insurance. I mean, you really need it when you need it, and if you don't have it, it can bring a farm to its knees if you need it when you don't have it that year.
Hey, Janie, this is Dean. I think one of the points you're making there, because a lot of people will have their coverage and, read it, but understand it. Understand what you're purchasing, how it's going to work for you in the event of an issue. Because usually, I can tell you, most folks really don't get into their policy until they have a problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so do your homework, read the darn thing, ask questions.
And if you don't, exactly, and if you don't, and I say this all the time, if you read your policy and you're going, what does this say? Call us. I mean,
yeah. Let's get it clarified.
Last person, don't worry about it. Pick up the phone and say, what Dean does this mean? I am clueless. Yeah. Or pick up the phone and call Janie and say, what does this mean? I get those questions all the time, but you'd be shocked how many people don't do that.
Right.
Thank you for weighing in. Yes, there are reasons why every word is in those insurance contracts. and
if something is typed in all bold letters, read it more than once.
Exactly. It's very, very important. The other thing I get asked a lot is, and this may seem like kind of a stray issue, but I really always try to throw it in. A lot of people think, well, I can just be any business entity I want. By that I mean an LLC, a partnership, a sole proprietor, an S Corp, a C Corp, any number of other business entities. And it's shocking to me still how many farmers and food producers still are sole proprietors. And the reason, you don't have to be one of these other entities, but it to yourself to actually understand the different kinds of business entities they are and the different advantages they may bring to you, not only tax advantages, but how you actually, undertake, how you market, how you actually analyze your finances. A business entity can kind of force your operation into a different level of record keeping even. I've seen that a lot, of just being more diligent about how you actually construct your business. And sometimes that business entity is nothing but a tax reason that you do it. But sometimes it is to try to limit your exposure to certain things. LLCs are in pretty common use around the country now. When I was going to law school, there wasn't such a thing as an LLC. LLC is limited liability corporation. That's not, there are multiple types of LLCs at this point. But what I share with people all the time is strongly consider becoming a business entity of your choice. But do your homework, figure out what kind of business entity makes sense for you. And what I will tell you is that many of these business entities truly have not been fully tested by the courts in a food safety liability context. So just be aware that just because you put that LLC suit on, that doesn't mean it's going to keep you from being sued. It may be kind of an additional kind of bit of armor that you put on to actually help you have a better outcome at the end of the day. And Dean and Gordon, please weigh in if you think differently about business entities.
Nope, I think you nailed it. That's
Thank you.
So
records?
We see it in our side of the business too. There is still a lot of sole proprietors and things, and it's like, you're kind of assuming maybe more risk than you need to. So
Exactly, and that's what I always tell folks is don't do your homework. If you're going to be a sole proprietor, then understand everything else and make that choice with your eyes wide open.
Yep.
A lot of people just never bother to think about it, so they don't even ever make themselves make a choice. And so it's just, I've seen too many instances where people have been deliberate about becoming a different form of business entity, and the deliberateness of that has helped them in their operation over the long haul. But again, I'll tell you, records. Dean and Gordon, records are vitally important in a crop insurance context, but they're equally important in managing your risk around food safety liability. And I'll tell you, as these FSMA requirements kick in over time, they're going to become extremely important in that food safety context. So if you don't have a good record-keeping system, it's time to get one. Correct?
I agree completely.
Thank you. So anyway, again, I'm really big about throwing in admonishments from time to time. Keep up with the changes in laws and regulations. It's just very important. Anything that has to do with what you love to do, which is food. There's a whole, the whole array of professional, development that needs to happen. Regardless of what you grow or how you grow it or where you grow it. You've just got a lot of homework that you need to keep on top of, in addition to actually being the best producer. And so just don't stop with making sure you got the best tomato, because that's just a part of the picture. Keep going. I think what I'm going to do, again, I've said this before, train your employees, meet with them regularly. You've got to have good relationships with the people who are actually helping you do what you do. Also, if you haven't yet, think about reaching out to regulators, health and ag departments. If something happens, it's so much better if you actually know somebody in those departments and they know who you are, so you're not some stranger to them. I think farmers and ranchers have a propensity to be away from people way too much. And so it's just really, really good to, at some point, maybe once a year, go sit down with the folks in the health and ag departments, check in, say hi, what's happening, what's new, what's coming down the pike. It just really is important to really think about your relationships with those folks as well, to kind of demystify what it is that they do, because they may have some really great resources to kind of keep you out of the ditch, so to speak. Keep going. Is Indian country different? Yes. I will tell you right up, the legal frameworks in our jurisdictions are different than the regular state and local jurisdictions. But here's what I'll tell you. These general principles that we're talking about today about prevention of illness, about biological hazards, about employee relationships, about reasonableness, about your responsibilities as a producer, as your duties to read your contract, things of that nature are the same. They're exactly the same. There are some pieces of the puzzle that are different as to Indian country and tribal jurisdiction and the role of tribal governments and all of that. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about foodborne illness, we're talking about bacteria doesn't care where it is. And so we just need to know that there's pieces of these food puzzles, particularly on the food safety side, that are very important to know that are the same across the board and apply no matter where you are, no matter who you are, and no matter what you're growing. These kinds of general responsibilities apply with equal force. Again, I think I've already covered this, so let's keep going. I threw in some slides that upon being sued, I don't want you to be sued ever. That is my whole purpose in life as a lawyer, is to keep people from being sued and prevent. But I gave you some slides to really think about. The best thing you can do is, if you ever get sued, is to have a good lawyer. You have got to try to do that. Find one where you are that knows food and agriculture and knows these rules, because it's not something you can turn over to somebody who only does divorces, so to speak. Sorry. A little weigh in on my profession here. This next set of, it's kind of a two-step here, and I'm going to quickly roll through some things that I just wanted to kind of lay out to you very quickly. I really feel that the most important thing I can do right now, before we get fully into FSMA, because we're going to be doing some more FSMA webinars also, is to give you a brief overview of these FSMA requirements. They literally only became final requirements last fall. And so we are in the total early stages of Food and Drug Administration actually kind of rolling these out. What the essence is of these new food safety produce rules and HACCP requirements, et cetera, and it's thousands of pages of regulations, incapable of being fully handled in one webinar. But I wanted to share with you just some resources, and I'm going to quickly go through those. And then I'm going to turn it over to Gordon and Dean. Food and Drug Administration, go back, Brian. Food and Drug Administration, please understand, is an agency that is not in USDA. It is an agency of the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's responsible for the safety of roughly 80% of the food in the U.S., including fresh and fresh-cut produce. So I just saw an article that was written that quoted me incorrectly today, and it talked about food safety, and it talked about USDA and produce. Well, USDA has a nominal responsibility in produce. FDA is the driving force, and it is not even in the same department at the federal level. That is because USDA's primary responsibility has always been in the poultry, meat, and egg component of food safety. And if you're talking about wild game, then you're talking about a whole different conversation, and we are going to have some learning opportunities later just around this whole area of wild game, which is very important in a lot of tribal communities. So just understand that there's a distinction, and it's kind of a common mistake people make, that all food safety sits under the responsibility of USDA. It does not. The big swath of it sits at FDA. Keep going to the next slide. It also, these new regulations and requirements talk a lot about hazardous analysis and critical control points, which is a meat and poultry HACCP plan kind of terminology. The FDA and FSMA requires hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls planning, which is basically the same thing as a HACCP plan. So don't get yourself all balled up about, some huge differences. It's basically the same sort of approach, which is basically what we walked through today, which is deconstructing every kind of compartment of how you do your produce, growing and harvesting and packing and storing, et cetera, all the way to consumption. It literally, that's the same sort of methodology that's used on the meat and poultry side. I've given you a link to some very specific kind of plan requirements, but there's a lot of resources out there that are readily available publicly so that people can kind of understand what it means to actually develop a HARP-C plan or a HACCP plan. There are some requirements under the new FSMA for food facilities to be registered with the federal government, but farms don't necessarily have to do that. And so it's very important that you really kind of understand. You've got to figure out exactly whether your farm is, quote unquote, a food facility. And there are very specific requirements for what a food facility is. It's impossible for a webinar to really give, bottom line, here are the 3 things that apply to everybody. That is not how this works. How this works is you walking through the necessary analysis to determine exactly what you are doing on your farm or in your food business, and figuring out exactly where it sits in terms of what your requirements are. So keep going, Brian, because there's a group of next slides that are very important. Some of it has to do with if you're going to be manufacturing and processing, there are certain requirements for registering. And you think, well, I'm not a big, huge manufacturing operation, but manufacturing it's the act of doing something with the food. So if you go back to that a couple of slides back, Brian, there's a lot of activities that are actually considered to be manufacturing and processing that you would think would only, maybe your thought is you're small and it doesn't apply to you, but actually it could. So again, you've got to deconstruct what it is you're actually doing and see if it meets the definition of manufacturing and processing, which would take you down a certain path of whether you have to register or not. Some of the requirements for registering also have to do with the amount of income you have from your particular farm, as well as where your markets are. Some markets have exclusions if you don't market past a certain number of miles, from the farm gate. But, many folks market well beyond that. So you just got to, again, there are some basic rules in FSMA, and the smaller you are, the more time you're going to have to actually come to terms with what all of these mean for your particular operation. The larger operations are having to come to terms with these within the next year. The next size operations are dealing with this in the next 2 years. And the smaller operations and the very smaller actually have 3 to 4 years to come to terms with these. But at the end of the day, the process for understanding what pertains to you and what doesn't is the same for every level. You've got to assume that you are going to be covered by these regardless, and you've got to figure out exactly what they say. And a lot of my guidance too over time has been is if there is a question about whether you fall under these requirements or not, it's always better to err on the side of I'm going to comply anyway. Because the last thing you need to do is to be implied in a foodborne illness outbreak and have kind of arbitrarily determined that you're exempted, but nobody's agreed with you. And then all of a sudden somebody comes and says, well, you really weren't exempted. You don't have any record that anybody agreed with you that you were exempted, so we're going to place you in a circumstance where you're not going to let you sell off of your farm. That's literally what you need to avoid, is being in a place where you are temporarily shut down because nobody can figure out exactly what it is you're doing. So that is a very important thing to think about. Keep going, and we're going to kind of roll through some of these because I want to get to, keep going. Oh, and before you get off this one, a lot of people say, well, is my home garden covered? Well, nobody really cares whether you eat out of your backyard or not. I mean, that really is not the issue. The problems you have in all of this food safety arena is if you are selling. And if you are selling into the stream of commerce, then you've got to stop long enough to figure out what of these things do apply to you and what you need to be thinking about doing in order to make sure that you aren't walking into some problems. It's a basic risk assessment, but if you are selling your products to any market, you've really got to seriously consider whether or not what you're doing falls under these new laws and requirements. Keep going. Keep going. All right, I've gotten you to the beginning of a checklist, and it's a food safety requirement checklist, and it literally is a wonderful tool to actually walk through what it is that I'm doing. Do you grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce? No. Well, you're not likely covered under the rule. Yes, I do. Then you likely are covered by the rule. But is it only for personal consumption? I love checklists. I found this one. It's done by the Sustainable Ag Coalition folks. Great resource, but it's also being picked up by other places. I've seen it used in multiple other places as well. But these kinds of checklists are really good tools to make yourself kind of walk through what it is you're doing, to kind of see exactly if you do this, then where do you go next to figure out what your requirements are, and if you don't do this, then what else should you be thinking about. Checklists are great to get you down to the granular level of what actually applies. So the next several slides in this webinar resource are really walking you through what it is you're doing and what kinds of requirements may apply to you. Keep going. Again, I've already said previously that if you're a very small business, you may have a longer time to come into compliance than if you were a larger business. Again, I'm not going to repeat that any further. Keep going. Again, keep going. We're still on, we've got 5 or 6, 7 or 8 different kind of checklist slides that are here. We've also given you lots of definitions that are in the regulations themselves so that you can actually see how you fit within the regulations. But again, taking your operation and kind of sitting it alongside what these definitions are and what the different pathways are for what you must comply with is an exercise that I can't do for you. I can help you kind of think through, what it is you're doing in the context of that, but you really have to, walk through that process yourself. Keep going. You can keep going. We did throw in some slides around just what kind of records you need to be thinking about, what's involved in your food safety planning, what hazard analysis content you need to have in your food safety plan, what preventive controls you need to actually identify as a part of your food safety plan, what monitoring activities you're going to do in your food safety plan, how you're going to deal with corrective actions once you find something. It's really HACCP and HARP-C are really about self-analysis, verification. How are you going to verify what it is that you're putting in place as a control mechanism? Reviewing your plans ever so often just to make sure that they're still, in compliance with the requirements at the overarching level, but checking them against whether you've changed your process and need more to kind of fine-tune what you're doing. If you're in business with other people, it's really important that you keep an eye on what they're doing. That doesn't mean you just, are in their business and scrutinizing. You've just got to have a deliberate conversation with the people you're in business with because you are in their supply chain. And so just understanding that y'all are all a part of it together will really make each kind of cog in the wheel think about what they're doing and be as diligent as they can be so that they're good partners to you. Keep going. And I think let's keep going towards that one circle. Keep going. There you go. There's a great circle kind of visual that I've thrown into this latter part of our slides. It really kind of helps you think about this is a part of a whole, and it just is a part of a whole that feeds into itself and just keeps going. It's all a part of this internal preventive control analysis so that you can actually examine your own risk. It begins with identifying the hazards, and then you push yourself through what are your preventive controls, and then how are you going to monitor yourself, and how are you going to actually implement corrective actions, and how are you going to keep an eye towards verifying what you're doing, and what is your record keeping. And then if you're really doing this on a constant level, this is going to continue to occur, this kind of circular analysis internally, and it's going to make you be in a better place. And I will tell you that many of our friends that we talk with all the time here at the initiative that are already in these spaces of voluntary certifications and HACCP planning and all those sorts of training mechanisms, I will tell you they do show up in your bottom line. The more diligent you are in these risk assessment procedures, regardless of whether you're doing it to really think through what you need in terms of crop insurance or thinking what you need in terms of preventing foodborne illness, it's going to end up, if you're diligent and consistent about it, you're going to show yourself that you will have a higher profit margin. I've heard it too many times. So with that, Dean and Gordon, it's all yours. Tell us what this has to do, if anything, with crop insurance.
Well, thanks, Janie. Boy, a lot of information here, and I think when we think about how does this tie back crop insurance and what we can do to help producers, well, there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and when we look at an individual's farming operation, it's really what coverage is out there available on the production side and revenue side, but how do we put that package together, and how, what is the information that we need to gather from the producers to put those programs together, and I think for our side of things, I mean, we can't insure on the crop insurance side, the issues that you've been talking about. But what we can do is, through these programs, I think, help provide some of the tools that you're going to need if you're going to try to do some of the GAP certifications and some of those kinds of things. And a lot of our producers that we work with today are doing that. So,
do we need to go to your slides?
If we could go to, just kind of move through a little bit. I don't know how far down we're. Oh.
Brian, let's move over to their slides. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that. I was like going, wow, somebody did a really nice job here on these, but they're not ours.
Hang with us just a second. Brian's slipping over to your slides.
Okay. Well, and as we get started on that, really, truly, we're just kind of looking at the record-keeping part of this, and some of the requirements that the federal crop insurance program, where they're looking at, farm mapping, map-based acreage reporting. So go to the next slide, and we'll kind of start getting into some of the pieces where I think the information that you're having to provide for your crop insurance needs is going to tie into some of the other requirements that are going to help you as you move through this process of identifying, where's your production coming off of, what are the records that you have, and how are you keeping track of your production? So if there is an issue, it can kind of that traceability, that opportunity to go back and say, okay, where did this production come from? The actual location, in the farm, what block or unit are we talking about? Because we require that those production records really be able to track back to a specific location, so that when we're setting up your insurance and your guarantees on those various locations, that those production records, the maps that we use, and we'll examples here, really all tie that information together. Some of the things that we'll look at is some of the quality pieces that are coming into play, and when you're working with your your packing sheds, your where you're delivering your production to, they're going to be providing some feedback on some of those quality issues and things that what we call the pack outs, and that can help identify maybe some areas where where you have an opportunity to change farming practices or just be aware, I guess, of some issues that are taking place out in the field once they kind of run that produce and see what's happened. One of the requirements for federal crop insurance is really that you're maintaining good farming practices. And the folks that we work with, there's some guidelines for that, but obviously that does a couple things. It allows you to probably maximize your production and the quality of your production. It gets you the highest returns. Good farming practices, just pay off in the long run, and not only for for your income side of the business, but I'm sure ties very directly to your food safety issues that are going to come into play. So it's a package that comes together. The record keeping, I think you can go back one more, but just touching on the record keeping and where your spray records and those kind of things that really are telling the story on what you're doing out there on the farm on any given day. When do we apply, what chemical where, and are we doing things on the farm that are generally accepted and approved farming practices for the area. I think that's really, really important to be able to demonstrate that. Let's go to the next one, Brian. One of the things I think that's really important and has evolved over the years is our ability to provide customers with some really detailed maps of their farming operation. And those maps, I know for a lot of our producers that are trying to get GAP certifications, global GAP, they're using these maps, they're using the records that they're having to provide to us. It all just ties together. It's that package that they have to put together as part of that certification process. And so it's really kind of goes hand in hand with what we're doing. So it's, where's the farm located? What are the acres? When were they planted? What practice types, varieties are you farming? And we can show all of that. If you go to the next slide, we can show all of that data and that detailed information on the maps. And it's really a nice, we just did a snapshot of one here that's got some apples and some grapes. But really when we get right down to it, it's like, here's the varieties that the year planted on these, whether they're organic or not, whether, some of their farming practices, and each one of those blocks now, our growers will be providing the production breakouts that show what came off of, these various blocks, so that it ties back to their insurance guarantees and how we can break that out for the coverage that they need on the production and quality losses and revenue losses that can come into play. And it just kind of, I don't know, I guess becomes the glue that kind of ties everything together. When there's a claim, if there's an issue, we provide the companies that we work with copies of the maps so that they've got a snapshot of the farming operation and can see exactly what's planted where and have that detailed information required to help settle claims. So again, just kind of ties that whole data, record-keeping information, puts a nice little bow on it, so that you've got this information available to you as you work through some of the other processes that you need that are maybe outside the crop insurance, but the same information that folks are looking for. Does that help, Janie?
It does. It does a lot.
You might want to, just on this,
These are the records that everybody's going to need regardless.
Right. Gordon's got some comments, though. I want to make sure he gets his.
Well, I just wanted to point out on this map, some of the global gap requirements. Typically for crop insurance, we would not list the chemical storage location or the chemical mixing, or down towards the bottom left, the wellhead. Those sort of things are added to these maps as an additional service for some of these requirements that you talked about, Janie, earlier, for these gap and global gap. So once again, we can tie both of these programs together by providing information and data and maps that will help satisfy all those requirements, and tie it back to the farm and the operation. Janie, you had mentioned before that if there is a food safety issue, the first thing they want to do is tie that produce or that potential issue back to the original location. And if you can see that visually on a map, you have the plant dates when it was planted, you know the harvest dates, the production that was produced and harvested off that location, and where it went, and what the disposition of that produce was, then that goes a long way in tying these together.
Yeah, and let me kind of give you an example, and y'all, YouTube, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but I mean, let's play out that a foodborne illness problem happened, and that it happens with regard to a particular product. We've got this map that you gave in your presentation, before us. But let's say, for example, that there's a neighbor to this operation that kind of grows the same things, right? And how about if the foodborne illness can't really be traced back to my farm, but it might have come off my neighbor's farm? The thing that's going to distinguish who actually kind of set in motion the problem is the kinds of records that you're talking about here that you've shown us visually. I mean, if they can trace it back to Pink Lady, but Pink Lady is not grown on my operation, right? Then it's going to be much easier for me to go to administrative investigators and or somebody else and say, this is not me. You're barking up the wrong tree. You need to go look somewhere else. And I think that we kind of discount the level of specificity that's going to be needed in the coming years to really kind of prove your point. It helps you all. It helps you all in terms of the crop insurance side of the house, but it also helps the producer, should there ever be a foodborne illness problem, to really prove themselves out of certain circumstances of kind of being in the eye of the storm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, it can go both ways. I mean, it can keep you out of trouble, and it can. I think it can. If there is an issue, we got to deal with it. So,
right.
What's going on? And so I think it's just fabulous information to have, available to you. So
I agree. So, do we want to say anything kind of here at the end, or do we want to just bid everybody goodbye and we'll just see them at the in-person? Brian, do you want to close us out?
I certainly will.
Thank you, Gordon and Dean, first. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Good information.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I'd like to thank our presenters for today's webinar, Food Safety, an in-depth update on FSMA and how crop insurance figures into food safety for the Pacific Northwest and Upper Great Plains. This concludes our webinar. If anyone wants to get any of the materials that we use today, just please contact us at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and we'll get them over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.